Hey Phil, good afternoon for me. Good morning to you. From my Friday to your Saturday.
That's right. Yeah, we live in the future down here in New Zealand.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm glad to get you on finally for this. We've known each other for quite a few years, at least in the Microsoft and MVP circuit, and it's a long overdue to finally get you on for a stream. So I appreciate you coming on today.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I noted. I think prior to pre-COVID, we got a chance to connect for the first time in at least a few years at Sequel Bits this year, right?
That's right. Yep. And I was up there.
Yeah.
Lucky enough to get up there for the first time. I'd heard very good things about SQL Bits, and yeah, when I got the chance this year to get up and actually see what all the fuss was about, I jumped at the opportunity. I really enjoyed it, and I can see why people rave about it. So if you do get the chance to get along as an attendee or a speaker, I highly recommend it. I can see what all the fuss is about.
Yeah, I will say like hands down, Europe throws much better conferences when it comes to the after conference events and community and everything. Like the US ones are fun for sure, but it's sponsors and other like private event type things that are where people you have to know someone to like know where the cool things are versus I feel like the conferences themselves officially host really cool events. Sequel Bits has the dance party where everybody's in costume every year, so I thoroughly
Mm.
enjoyed that one, and Alex Whittles and his crew just they put on one of the, I think, most community driven ones, and they're one of the few conferences and one of the first that ever started doing soft skills talks. Like I presented on how using ADHD as a superpower, working in tech, and other conferences have started to do that, but SQL Bits I feel like was one of the early adopters of like soft skills and mental health as topics for tech related stuff.
Yeah, although I have heard some very good things that I'm not allowed to say anything about the FabCon in the US next year in Las Vegas
Oh,
in
yeah.
April. So there have been some mutterings about what they have planned there that sound like it's going to be a great one to get to if you're nearby the US. And of course, we've got the European FabCon coming up in September, which I'm going to be heading up for from New Zealand, which I'm really looking forward to.
Nice. Well, fingers crossed I'll get a chance to run into you there. The session that I presented with Kurt at the Vegas one, which had about 780 attendees. It was insane the amount of people in
Mm,
the room. We
yeah.
resubmitted that as well over to the European one. So fingers crossed that I'll be there in September and seeing you then. But
Cool.
I think with any of the guests that I have on for these streams, what I like to do is give the channel a little bit of a chance to get to know you and hear some of the background on like what you do, what your role is, and where you've come from before we get started with any demos or presentations. So if you want to take a little bit of time to run through kind of like what you do within the industry.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so I work on for Microsoft on a team called CAT, or Customer Advisory
Mhm.
Team, and this particular team has 1 foot in the customer camp and 1 foot in engineering. We're not a sales team at all, and we very much lobby on behalf of typically larger enterprise customers. We spend time with them trying to understand precisely what they're trying to solve, how they're going about it. Inevitably, when you're dealing with very large volumes of data, lots of people, you're going to hit a few bumps here and there. So we are able to help them remove those bumps and barriers, but equally we can take that information and share it directly with our engineering team, so that when we're prioritizing what we're likely to build next,
Yep.
we can make sure that we're building what people need as opposed to perhaps other software orgs might get fall into the trap of building what they think their customers need. But it's good fun because, as I mentioned, I get to work with customers with very large data volumes, lots of users, so really get to see what it takes to make engines inside Fabric and Power BI shine at their best. So my particular role on CAT is I'm a DAX and data modeling specialist, mostly I think because no one else wants to learn DAX, but that suits me.
Fair.
I quite enjoy it. I've always been a developer of some form, and even 20 years ago, I started doing work in business intelligence or decision support, as it was known then, and helping organizations building cubes and data warehouses back in those good old days. And we used to call the whole process of ETL, load, stage, persist. I think it's bronze, silver, gold now, but otherwise it's
Yep.
just exactly the same thing.
New words,
Um,
same concepts, right?
exactly. Yep. Yep. But it's important. You want to get data which is in all kind of shape and quality and volumes synthesized nicely down to an environment and inside a tool such as a BI tool, so that non-technical people don't have to worry about writing queries, but they can quickly see insights. And one of the stories that really made a light bulb go off in my head about the power of business intelligence was I was working for a big supermarket retailer here in New Zealand. And at the time, the supermarket retailer would do a promotion on a regular schedule with a large multinational, who I won't name. But as it turned out, someone out in a store who wasn't even part of the analytics team got access to these cubes and Excel pivot tables, etc., and was able to dive down and play in their own time. And they figured out that, hey, every time we ran this promotion, it was actually costing the organization, something like $50,000, $60,000 in revenue and profit, and they could demonstrate it using the BI tools. And it allowed the organization to renegotiate, future contracts. But it just the democratizing the data and making it so easy, because this individual was not writing DAX or MDX queries; they were just having access to data. I mean, in those days, if you needed a report, you would send an email off to IT and you were lucky to get a result a week later. And then if you wanted to iterate on that, chess by mail just wasn't fun. So that really showed me the power of what being able to get data like this in an accessible, easy to access way to non-technical people just shows the power of it. So, and of course, we've just seen it evolve and get better and better over time with Power BI, new versions of analysis services, etc. So I've always kind
what
of
wave are we in now, technically?
Pardon?
There's there's all those, there's the IT waves, and are we in the fourth wave at the? Because wave 3 was the beginning of self-service BI, and I think we're either on wave 4 unless wave 5 has come out as a new labeling.
I don't know, but if you're going to be talking waves this year, you probably have to put the word AI in there somewhere, whether you agree with it or not. It's an AI wave that we're going through, and it's exciting. I can definitely see when it does amazing things, and I sit back and go, wow, that is pretty cool. But equally, I can see, well, what's the point? But we'll see how it goes.
But the easiest way I can summarize it today is what's your opinion on it? It makes a good assistant, but an assistant that you still want to check the work of. At some point, it will. I'm sure it will be there. It will be a self-reliant employee that can do its own thing. But for now, it's a great assistant that saves me a lot of busy work.
Yeah, I've definitely used it successfully multiple times. But there are also times where I've tried it and it doesn't really give me what I need, and I end up doing it myself. But I'm no worse off. That's what I would have done anyway. So. But yeah, so my role on CAT is DAX and data modeling specialist, and I generally get the opportunity to work, as I said, with very large companies on large data sets. So yeah, it's good fun. So
when I dropped in the chat for people curious the DAX games link where you make those were one of my favorite things to poke around with. You did and. Temple of Dax, that was a Zelda one, kind of like the Zelda dungeon crawler type thing, right? Or it looked type similar to that.
Yeah, and I actually think, because I wrote those games before I started working for Microsoft about 5.5 years ago, and I actually think that's why they hired me, because the analysis services team saw that, and they were saying, just stop abusing our product. This is not what the engine is meant to do. So let's hire him, get him busy doing stuff that's not game related, and sure enough, it worked. I did end up having to spend an awful lot of time figuring out how to do my role in Microsoft. Although I do have one that I have to finish off and share at some point, which is kind of cool. I looked at it the other day for the first time, and it's a pretty cool example of what you can do. Often the point of it is to think out of the box, because sometimes I encounter people that say, hey, I've got this matrix, and on the matrix, I'm not seeing the numbers I'm expecting to see. And I perhaps point out, hey, look, if I can do 3D maps and create these maze worlds using DAX, I'm pretty sure we'll be able to get your matrix to arrive at the correct number that you're expecting. Maybe tweak the DAX. Often simplify the DAX is the key to getting
Yeah.
accuracy to improve, and solve it in the data model.
The now is the one that you're talking about, is that the one that you were working on with Kerry Klosko, or a different one than that?
Yep. Yeah. So if I get the opportunity to
Okay.
work with someone who's got amazing design skills, because I've got zero design skills, then I'll obviously jump at that chance. It's not unusual in my line of work. In my Teams chat, I'll just get a message out of the blue from Miguel Myers saying, "Phil, you got time for a call?" And I know where this is going. He's probably doing
Yeah.
something really crazy and on an amazing deadline. And again, the opportunity to collaborate with people that are so talented on the design side, when I've got zero talent on that, is always good fun. So I do enjoy the chance to do that. I have zero interest also in improving my design skills as well. So that's why Copilot's quite good for people like me, because I've just pretty much given up trying to design beautiful looking reports. I'll make them fast, but they will be ugly.
There, outside of a few exceptions, there's definitely people who lean heavily, usually on one of the two sides of the brain, the analytical versus creative. I feel like I do a decent job of kind of swimming between the two. But speaking of Carrie's and yours new DAX one, she actually will be on. There's no link to it yet, but I believe it's the second or third week of August. You'll be coming on for a live stream specifically to talk about that one that I guess you two might be like finishing off soon. But I'm excited to see that one
Cool.
because it, like I said, and that was even the original reason to reach out to invite you on this one before we decided on the other topics. But I do like the idea that you mentioned where there's a lot of times where you don't build something because it's practical, you build it because it's fun. So like all of those DAX puzzles are just, it's a combination of what can native visuals do, or custom visuals, combine it from the report perspective, and mash together with an engine and SVGs and all this other fun, unique stuff. But the one that you did a couple of years ago, I had somebody on my live stream who did like it was a Harry Potter like puzzle, maze puzzle
I think I
kind
know
of a
the one.
thing. Yeah, and you go through pages, and there was like hidden bookmarks and pop-ups and all this stuff where you have to like solve a bunch of riddles to get to the end of it. And I think it's cool when you can take things like that and and make something fun out of a report, which is clearly not designed to do it, but it gets the creative juices flowing for some people on unique ways for them to maybe do stuff that actually could be applied to real world scenarios potentially. And at the minimum, it's just fun. I'm sure you like to build them, even though it probably took you many hours to do some of those.
Surprisingly not, but
Oh, okay, nice.
yeah. But some people like to relax in the
Yeah.
evening by watching TV. Others do Sudoku. Sometimes I just like to do some crazy things in DAX that you wouldn't normally do, and that's how I relax. So
There's almost a degree of like, it's a creative thought that you get in your brain that needs to come out and be put somewhere, right? Like I've had those itches before. Mine's more in the creative process, but sometimes like I'll be on a couch and in the middle of doing something, an epiphany of something to do comes out. I go back to my computer desk because I need to put it down and have it materialize in some fashion. The only thing, the last comment that I just want to say a little bit on with the cat team before we flip into the topic of today is I'll be curious of your experience on this, but I've heard from a lot of people like Rui, Benny, others on the cat team where they thought they knew enterprise voice before they started working on the cat team. But then once they actually started working on it, the amount of like unique scenarios that are at scale when you have 500,000 Power BI users, like some of these companies that just are massive, like they own hundreds of tenants alone for the organization, and like how much of a like I think I understand some of the problems that I'll see at scale versus like I have no idea some of these like unique client scenarios that really only apply when you're a company that large in terms of we have a specific need or problem that just is non-existent at the SMB level.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. Like some teams, some organizations I work with will have 20 or 30 capacities. Their BI teams alone will be massive, and they'll be spread geographically. So how do you organize who works on what? How do you split? Yep. Who does the DAX? Who does the data model? Who does the report, for example? And you're all trying to get this solved for a deadline, for example. And as I said, inevitably you'll bump into a challenge like, okay, we're going to send out a particular report, first thing next Monday morning, and we
Mhm.
know when that email gets opened, a very large volume of people are going to click on that report, and we want to make sure that their experience is not terrible, because
Yeah.
if they all try and open the report and it takes a minute or two to load, they're not going to come back. They're going to get they're not going to be in the best mood first thing on a Monday, maybe anyway. So you really need to make sure
Fair.
everything goes well. And there's a lot to tune. Sometimes I like to think about it as working as an engineer on a Formula One car. And what you're trying to do is make the Formula One car get around the track as quickly as possible. So sometimes you're thinking aerodynamics, sometimes you're thinking tires, maybe with gearing, whatever. But this is not the same as how you would approach the car that's in your garage outside. But a lot of the lessons you learn at the Formula One level, if it's successful, does inevitably trickle down to all users using Power BI, running queries, inevitably, eventually. So I get the chance to really try and make that Formula One car scream around the track as quickly as possible, and try and take those lessons back. Inevitably we do update the engine, and as I said, it's always improving, always evolving. We're always adding new DAX functions. The topic of today, we're talking about fabric storage engines. So
Mhm.
we've added a brand new storage engine only a year ago. We've had two pretty good storage engines up till now, and now we've got a third fantastic one to add to the mix. So and I'm sure in 5 years' time there'll be a whole bunch of things in the product at that time that don't exist yet today, that we haven't even thought about necessarily. It might
Mhm.
be, an engagement I'm lucky enough to work with next month might highlight the need for something to be added to the engine. We figure out if it makes sense. We build it in, we test it, develop, and obviously many people can start taking advantage of that down the track. So
When I think you brought up a perfect segue to also thinking about the historical and then new storage mode options that we have now in Fabric, but the topical conversation is really the ways we can data model essentially. So
mhm.
if you're ready, we can kind of
Yeah,
switch
yeah,
gears
yeah.
into that and start the conversation there. I know you have an initial slide ready for that, so good to flip over to the screen.
Yeah, actually, although what I might do is try to do another one. Control
Oh,
Shift
sure, absolutely.
work, function F5. Yeah, you can flip over the screen.
Yeah.
So inevitably, what we're trying to do, hopefully you can see this.
There we go. Got it.
This is not where I live. I'm hoping to move into this place next year. Only kidding. No, so what we're trying to do when we are building a data model is avoid making something like this. That's not going to house a lot of people. It's probably going to fall down. What we're trying to do is more build something like this. Grand, can cope with a large volume of people. People are going to come from miles to have a look at it. It's going to be there hopefully hundreds and hundreds of years later. But also what we're trying to do is avoid doing this, where people are actually going to come and have a look at your model, but not for the reasons that you want. So it's an old set of slides that I had from an older
I
one that
like
I
it.
do like to kind of start with occasionally. Um, but today, the topic of the stream today is about storage modes, and in particular, Fabric storage modes. But before we start with it, hopefully you can see this. There are three pillars of data modeling. It's really,
Mhm.
when you are a data modeler, I think you should be focused generally only on these three areas: data availability, model size, and query speed. So what do I mean by those pillars? So data availability is the time it takes before data becomes available in the source that you can
Mhm.
start running queries over it. So think typically if you're running an ETL, when the ETL is finished and you've got all your data, hopefully best practice in star schema, fact, and dimension tables, how long does it take before the model can start receiving queries and using that
Mm.
data? And we'll explain the three storage modes, how how they go with each of those. And then the model size. What size server? How much memory do you actually need? Because most of these models are in memory these days. In the good old days, we would have to make sure we bought enough disk. But the model size, you want to make sure that in the realm of, say, Power BI Premium, if you buy a P1, you're allowed, your model size can grow up to 25 gig, for example. So if you know ahead of time that you're likely to need a 40 gig of memory for your model, then obviously you need to buy an appropriate SKU. And a P2 might let you have up to 50 gig, leaving you 10 gig overhead. Not ideal, because if you're doing things like full import refreshes, it's not going to work. Incremental may work, still doesn't really leave a lot of space for headroom for queries and caching, RLS, that sort of stuff. So in the case of if you've got a 40 gig model, you either go for the next SKU, which might allow you to grow up to 100 gig at any particular point in peak in time, or you can optimize the model to reduce the size of the model. But that's another thing that we might think about. And we're going to talk about the 3 storage modes and how they score effectively on these 3 areas. And then lastly, probably the one that most people focus on too much, but I think it's equally as important as the other 2, is obviously the DAX query speed. So once you've got your data available, you've designed your model, you've made it available to the model, either by loading it in or configuring direct query, for example, how fast does it take those queries to run? And there's lots that you can do in these 3 areas. So with Fabric, that we announced around April last year, I can't remember the exact time. I'm going to go to the next slide. We did introduce a new storage mode, but let's have a look at the existing storage modes, because these both equally work well in the world of Fabric. I think there's a little bit of a misconception out there at the moment that people see Fabric and they're aware of this new storage mode called Direct Lake, which we'll get to, and they think, okay, I have to use Direct Lake if I'm going to be running Power BI reports in Fabric. But that's not true at all. If you have a Power BI report that you built 3 years ago and it uses direct query and it's perfectly fine, you can put that into a Fabric workspace and it will still continue to work exactly fine. There's no need to re-engineer it, rebuild it, unless you want to, because you're curious. But otherwise, you can just leave it alone. Equally, import is the same. If you've had a model that you've had running for many years in import mode in Power BI, and you want to run that in a Fabric workspace, you don't have to change anything. It'll continue to run as import, and all the variations of those as well. Like we have composite models where you can have a single semantic model where some tables use direct query storage mode, others use import storage mode, others use a mix called dual, and then you can lay up aggregations and all sorts of interesting things on that. What you can do with Fabric and direct query is use the SQL endpoint equally with import as well, if you want to use that as one of the many sources available to direct query and import today, if you are making that move. But here are the 3 pillars that we just talked about. So I've got a column here called data availability, model size, and query speed. And I've got a nice traffic light system here called happy face, unhappy face. And for small models, here's what I've personally rated it as. So direct query, data availability is happy face because it's just immediately available. If new rows turn up to your source table in your data warehouse and you refresh your Power BI report, it should reflect the latest state of the data. And that's really good for real-time scenarios, for example, that you might have data trickle feeding in. Equally, it could be massive data volumes. Because if we jump over to the model size column, same. With direct query, there's no model size. We don't hold or store any data in the model at all. Even in between queries, actually, if you reissue the same query, we will still send a query expression to the source and get the latest cut of the data, even if it happens to be the same data as we asked for 2 minutes previously. Query speed for direct query, I've got as a question mark, as an unhappy face, because it depends on so many factors.
True.
There's the capability of the the direct query source that you're connecting to, data volumes, network latency, firewall, security, proxy, co-locating. If you've got your data in a region in Europe, but your Power BI is running in North America, for example, there's going to be an effect on the query speed there. But I have seen plenty of successfully super fast models run in direct query. I think some people give it a bit of a hard time, and I think that's unfair, because if you do your work, you apply best practice to the source and obviously to the model, you can have direct query running very, very well, very successfully. So import across the three pillars is just happy face, because while you have to actually cache the data into the model, it shouldn't take long on a smaller model. We're talking even a million rows, which probably seconds, depending on the capability of your source. And, you can use partitions. Import compresses data really well. Usually we expect about 10x compression. So if you have 10 gig of data in CSV files or in your database, probably the model will only be 1 gig, which is at this day and age quite small. But query speed, if you follow best practice and you load your reports over an import model, you will absolutely get very good query speed. Now let's have a look at larger models. Oh, sorry, you had a question.
Yeah. Just and I don't know if this is something that come up later, is the direct query, as you know, when configured right, can be fast, but it's also very easy to misconfigure, I think, or end up with slow queries on that. But just considering that, like, the thing that to me really, I think, helped to bridge the two worlds together was when they released hybrid tables a few years ago with the incremental refresh, which you're direct querying 1%, maybe 3% of a fact table rather than 100% of it, and it's near import like performance. So I just loved when that came out, because every time I had a customer come up to me and it's like, oh no, we want real time data, like. And when I confirmed yes, they actually need it, because a lot of people think they do when they just need near real time. But for those scenarios, hybrids were such a godsend to come down. Like, okay, we can have performant models, and you can have data to the second every time I click a slicer selection, and your DBA will be happy that you're not making these massive queries from hundreds of users.
Yeah, and you can flip hybrid tables too the other way. So if you've got 5 years of data, you can say, let's just keep the most recent 2 years of data and import in memory, and years
Exactly.
3, 4, 5 ago can go direct query, because the chances are most of my dashboards are going to be focused on what happened this week, what happened this month. Let's compare this month with last month, or let's compare this month with the same month previous year, for example, and all that hits import. But on the occasion someone says, I want to look at a trend month by month that goes back 5 years, then the query will split it up. It'll send one to the direct query source and one to import, get the results, sew them back together. You don't have to write any DAX to do this. It does it automatically for you. And depending on the capability of your direct query source, it'll potentially be, you'll be oblivious to the fact that it needed to do this split storage mode in the background. And that helps you reduce the model size. That's that center pillar about how much
Exactly.
space do we need for the model, because we're only importing the recent 2 years worth of data. And so jumping to larger models with these two storage modes. So data availability with direct query doesn't change. I wonder if I can do this. Laser pointer. Here we go. So here's where we are. So data availability for direct query, like smaller models, it doesn't care. It doesn't matter whether you have 2 rows in the source table or 200 billion. The query will go this, and you'll get it immediately, the latest data. Again, the model size doesn't change, because we're not storing or caching any data in the model. If the source has 2 rows or 200 billion, it doesn't affect the model size for direct query based models. And query speed, again, is an unknown. It's probably more of an issue when you have larger data volumes, because you do need to make sure that whatever source you are using is tuned and you're applying best practices up there, and it's going to know how to receive your queries and turn them around super quick. I work with large customers that have a variety of direct query sources, and there are various things that you can turn on to improve the speed and capability of that source, often at a cost. But you can absolutely do work in the source to help speed that up, and making sure that you locate the data as close as possible to the model is going to help as well. Now, for import, here's where we start seeing not necessarily unhappy faces, but concerned faces. And the reason why I score it like this for import for data availability is it's because now it becomes, with larger models, something you have to think about and manage. Perhaps you do have a couple of billion rows of data. Now, if you just try and import that every single day, it might take several hours. But fortunately, with import, there are plenty of features and functions that you can do, such as incremental refresh, partitions. You can DIY your own partitions. So there are solutions, but it becomes something you need to think about and manage. And the data is still not going to be available for the reports to be queried until whatever approach to your refreshing is complete. And if you've got high transaction data streaming in, then hybrid tables is probably a good scenario to help solve that. But it's not an unhappy face. It's definitely solvable, but something you have to think about. Model size, again, now we start to grow, because as I said, if you have a 40 gig model, what SKU size do I need? Do I go for the 25 gig? No, doesn't work. Do I go for the 50 gig? Yes, it'll fit, but I can't do a full refresh. So I have to be careful and think about how I do things like update the data in the model to make use of the 10 gig of space that I have left over. And that 10 gig also gets used for queries, caching, security, a whole bunch of things as well. So as I mentioned earlier, you could go for the 100 gig SKU to fit my 40 gig model, which seems a bit overkill, but it'll work. You're going to spend more money doing that. Or you maybe can re-optimize or to redesign your model to shrink it down. Hybrid tables, cardinality, there's a whole bunch of ways that you can approach that. But I should have moved my pointer. Query speed. So long as you apply best practice, if you import data on very, very large volumes, hundreds of billions, then you still can get reports that will load in just a few seconds, for example. It definitely can do that, which is pretty cool. But with Fabric, what we did was we introduced a third new storage mode called Direct Lake. Now, this is not designed to make the other two obsolete. It is complementary. It's another tool in the tool shed to help you solve problems now a new way. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a little bit of a misconception, I think, that if you have existing direct query import or hybrid models today and you put them into a Fabric workspace, they will continue to work. If anything, what you might want to do is when you have net new projects to consider, then now you can go, all right, maybe I'll solve this by using direct query, or maybe I'll use import, or maybe I'll use direct lake. And it'll depend a lot on a whole bunch of things. And your decision might be import, and that's perfectly fine. It might be direct lake, it might be direct query, but we can spend a little bit of time talking a bit more about the differences between probably more direct lake and import, because there's a lot of similarity. There's a lot of overlap between those two. But how have I scored that? Direct query on small models is just happy faces. It's in a good mood all the way through. But importantly, I've scored it differently to import on larger models. So data availability is the time difference. If I have got 2 billion or 20 billion rows that I need to load in to my import model versus my direct lake model, we might be talking the difference between an hour of processing time for the import model versus just a couple of seconds for direct lake. And there's reasons why it can do that so quickly. Model size. One of the big new things about direct lake is that columns can be paged out and paged in on demand. So we talked about that 40 gig model. Now, potentially, I wouldn't recommend this, but you could run a 40 gig direct lake model on a capacity that only allows you to go up to 25 gig, which, how does that work? And that's because when you create a direct lake model, it starts empty. The size of the model is, for all intents and purposes, 0 bytes. And then when people come and start using a model which uses direct lake, the query hits the model, and the query will page in data to be able to solve that query. And it does it column by column. So if I have a fact table with 100 columns, and I just want a sum of one of those columns, perhaps grouped by or filtered by a column in a dimension table, then it's not going to need all 100 columns and all rows for that fact table loaded for it to be able to answer that query. It can just page in just the data it needs for that column,
Yep.
which may grow the data from, say, 0 bytes to 1 or 2 gig, depending on how much we need for the column. So we're well and truly under the 25 gig. And then someone else comes along and runs a query over a different column, and we'll page that in, and then we'll page in another column and page in another column. And if you're rerunning queries over the columns we've already paged in, it'll continue to use them. It'll be like import. They're already there in memory. But when we start getting close to the 25 gig, remember, potentially, if all columns were fully loaded and all rows were fully loaded, we well and truly would be past the 25 gig. What we'll do is we will page out individual columns. We'll look at things such as, hey, we've got a column here that hasn't been queried for 6 hours or 10 hours. And if we just remove this one column from memory, we can free up 3 gig, 6 gig, and we can load in the column you need to solve your query. Now, as I said, I wouldn't recommend it, but the theory is you could actually run a direct lake model on a much smaller SKU size, but it's something you would need to watch and monitor in case you get thrashing and occurring. And you also need to make sure you follow best practice of direct lake to make sure that the time it takes to page data in is a fraction of a second. And if time permits, I can show you how quickly loading 1.5 billion rows or 1 billion rows can be when you follow best practice.
And
So I
on
don't know
this
if you
topic,
want to.
just and maybe you understand this question a little bit better, but Fernando just had a comment related to cooldown columns in terms of the page in, page out. If you understand the context of that,
Say that again. The cooldown columns.
Fernando had the comment is cooldown columns question mark. I didn't know if you understood the context of that related to the page in and page out in your model size, and
Yeah.
and the temperature.
Yeah. So every single column in a semantic model holds a numeric value which represents a temperature. So the more you query that column, the higher the number will go up. But it decays over time. So if you actually run a DMV query against your semantic model, it'll list what columns are currently resident in memory and when were they last accessed and what's the numeric value for the temperature. And if you rerun the query immediately straight away, you won't get the same result in the temperature. It will have gone down a little bit. You run a couple of queries against that column, temperature goes up. And it's a useful piece of information for us to figure out what we can evict if we do need to make room to load in new columns. But equally, it can be helpful for you as a model author to see over time, well, hey, the people I designed these reports for said they needed all these extra columns, but I don't see them getting queried very often. So perhaps what we could do is drop them from the model altogether, or perhaps what we'll do is put them into a different table and just put that table into direct query mode. And if they do, in fact, happen to query it occasionally, then I can keep my model size down. This would be an import direct query hybrid model where to do that. So, and actually, I think I saw in the chat, Fernando said, I never got your Delta Analyzer Python code to work for me. While you're listening, I did notice there was a bug when I went to use it recently. I had added some logic to go and report on Z order. We're not going to probably go there in this particular session. And when I downloaded it and ran it, I got an error. I fixed that. So if you've used Delta Analyzer in the past, which is a tool I've written to help analyze the health, the state of a table for Direct Lake, retry it. It'll probably work now. So
nice. Well, thanks for that. And just one other quick question from him before you get to the query speed. So
yeah.
the 0 byte model, does it change after a refresh or reframing of the semantic model? He thinks that's correct. Is just confirming.
Yeah, so at the moment, what happens is if you perform a reframe on a direct lake model, now a reframe pretty much just resets everything, evicts everything from memory. So if you've got a fully hydrated, fully in-memory model, and you perform a reframe, then at the moment it will evict everything. We are working on a feature to be released soon that will do that in a smarter way, so that you're not having to necessarily page in all data for very, very large columns each time when perhaps you didn't need to. So just keep your eye on that. We've got some things happening there. However, today, even on very large models, if you follow best practice, it shouldn't be an issue, to reframe. And a reframe is just going to the UX and clicking on a full refresh. And it should be quick. It should only take a couple of seconds.
And one last quick question.
Yeah.
Greg just wants to know where can you go to get the temperature data? Like if you wanted to find out what columns to delete, where should you go in Power BI to or the service in Fabric to figure that out for
Okay.
for admin
I'm
purposes?
I'm jumping over to Dex Studio because I like Dex Studio. I use it all the time, and we'll see how this goes. And I'm connecting to a model that I did connect to before this started. Now, in Dex Studio, once you've connected to a model, you can start writing Dex queries up here in the query. And when I hit the run button, we should get the results here. Let's go to model one, for example. And but here, a DMV tab. And if I click on DMV, this shows me a whole bunch of DMV queries that I can run against the model. Now, this doesn't query any data. It tells me about perhaps the state or the structure, all sorts of interesting things about the model that I'm connecting to. And I'm going to search on columns. And I think the one I want, I'm just going to double click on column from memory. This one, discover storage table columns. And it's going to say, interestingly, it doesn't look like DEX, select star from a DMV. I think these might also be info system tables as well. But when I run this, I'm going to get a result set, which is describing the model that I happen to be connecting to. One row in this result set represents a column in a table. And at the moment, the last two columns over here show me that there's a dictionary temperature, probably because I ran a DAX query over these recently. So this dictionary temperature, whoops, and dictionary last accessed. So if I say evaluate the values, if I can spell this correctly, evaluate values of a column in the table. What's this top one here? Device attributes OS. Doesn't sound like there'll be a lot of values here. This text query is just going to give us the distinct list of values in this very large table, actually. And we run the DMV now. The OS column, maybe I should sort by order by dictionary. Dictionary temperature. I know that last access descending. Hey, I probably should have just reframed the model. Find my mouse. Whoops. Okay, so I'm going to highlight this and run it. Some crazy things going on. Oh, descending. Put the unused columns here. So at the top, I'm expecting to see my OS column. And if we scroll over, the dictionary temperature has increased, and the time when I last accessed it, probably in UTC, is different to when I was playing with these just before the presentation. Now, I've got a customer who takes this DMV and they load it into a Fabric notebook, and they schedule this to run every 5 minutes, and they take the result set and they just accumulate it to a lakehouse table so that they can perform analysis, say in Power BI, of and heat maps of temperatures of certain columns as the day ebbs and flows. And you can use this as a way to identify what might be some interesting columns to cache warm, to actually just schedule some max value of query, or select the count rows of the values is probably safer, because there are data types that don't work with max or some strings and booleans,
That's
etc.
fair.
So yeah, heat map is kind of cool. So that's one way that you can go and have a look to see what the state.
Curiously, is that notebook script anywhere in a Git repository, or could that ever be made available as like a pattern, just that people could copy paste into their tenant to collect, record, put into a table and then analyze? Because I'm sure a lot of people would love to do that, right?
Mm. We should be able to do it only in about 3 or 4 lines of code.
Okay,
And
nice.
the semantic link Python library that should be your go-to Python library if you are using a
Mm,
Fabric notebook
okay.
allows you to execute DAX queries against a semantic model, including DMVs. And then that will give you a data frame with a result set that you can do analysis inside your notebook if that's what you like to do, or you can persist it, save it, append it, or overwrite it to a table in a lakehouse. And of course, once you've got it in a lakehouse, you can use direct query, import, or direct
Exactly.
lake to build interesting looking models over that data. And it's of interest to say who the owner of the report is to see what's going on. But you could probably spin this up over all of the models in your workspace if you're an admin using scripting. So
I might have to do a little short recorded video on that, like, because I feel like that would be a very useful way to figure out, like, oh yeah, this column was requested. It isn't a visual, but like nobody ever looks at this page or this thing, and it just helps you get rid of and lower the model size. Everybody would like to be able to trim the fat off a model if they can.
yeah, but I'm going to show
Super
you
cool.
direct lake.
Please, yeah.
I've got my model back here. I mentioned earlier in the call that it can page data in pretty quickly. So what I'm going to do is go to Power BI and Fabric. Cool. So I've got a model here that I used recently at a presentation I did up in Auckland, and I'm going to do everything in the web here. I'm not even going to use a tabular editor. I could use tabular editor. It's an excellent tool, especially for pro data modelers. But I have a lakehouse in my Fabric workspace, and my lakehouse has got some small tables, adventure work type tables. So what I'm going to do is add a billion row table, but I'm not physically going to put the data into this lakehouse because I don't
Hmm.
want silos. I'm going to create a shortcut to a table that I know has a billion rows of data that happens to be in a different lakehouse. And the good news is if that data changes, I immediately get the benefit for that. And I want this table that has a billion rows of data, and I want this table that has 2 billion rows of data. And I'll create that. So these are shortcuts. So these aren't physically putting the data in my lakehouse. It's a reference off to where the data physically is somewhere else. And you can chain these up. I think I did ask someone once, how many shortcuts can you chain up? But it is giving me a little bit of a preview here of what that might look like. So now that it's available in my model, in my lakehouse, I can go to my model, create a new one. I'm going to open this in my lakehouse and add those tables. So I'm going to edit tables and I'm going to add the 2 tables so they appear in my model. Now, I don't have to create relationships because there are no natural relationships between these demo tables and the existing tables in the model. And while that's happening, I'm going to jump back to DAX Studio and connect to that model, which should hopefully be. I think it's. No, it's not that. I'll have to get the workspace value that's worked. Data store, not manage access, workspace settings, license info. Here's the connection string that I can use for DAX Studio. I think I was trying to connect to the right place. It is that. Connect. And when this connects, we'll run the DMV and we'll look at the state of what columns have been loaded into memory. And my expectation is those last 2 columns in the DMV will be blank. And then we'll run a query
Yeah.
over one of the tables and then we'll rerun the DMV. But we'll also look at how long did it take that query to run. And to give you an idea about how quickly it can page in. So we might be ready. Have we got the right model? It's probably this one here. And here's my billion row table. Here's my 2 billion row table. I'm going to run the DMV first, scroll over to the edge, and the last two columns are empty. I'm sorting by dictionary last added. So what I'll do is evaluate, summarize columns. Let's group by maybe something in the date table. I'm going to query the small table first. So let's group by fiscal year, and let's do a sum of sales, sum of sales amount. That gives me sales. I wonder if I can grab it from here. I probably can. I've actually got a measure here already. If I bring this to where I need it. Sorry, I'm standing typing. I don't normally stand type. I'm normally sit typing. So we run this
Oh, I get
query
it.
pretty fast. I'm expecting it to be fast because the tables involved here are very, very small. And when we think about what happened, when I clicked the play button, what actually
Yep.
happened, the highlighted piece of text got transmitted across the network to the analysis services database, and it converted that to a query plan. And the query plan said, what columns do I need to be able to satisfy, provide the answer to this query? When it understands what column it has on a direct lake model, it says, have I got any of these columns resident in memory? And we just ran the DMV. We know that they're not resident. So it has to say, okay, I need to page these into memory. I'm going to go to the lakehouse and get the data for those columns, page them in, and then once that's been loaded into the model in memory, laid out nicely, we can run the DAX query over it, and we see the result. And if we look at the DMV and scroll across, we can see now that there's 4 rows populated. We have the fiscal year column. That makes sense because we're grouping by fiscal year, and we're summing the sales amount from the fact table. But we also have 2 other columns, and the reason why we're paging those in is because they're the columns in the relationship. So we need to get those resident in memory so that we can satisfy the query. But that was pretty quick. And if I change this to be grouped by something else, grouped by first fiscal quarter, and run this. Now, 3 of the 4 columns are already paged in. So what's happened now is we only needed to page in the fiscal quarter column, which the DMV is now showing 5 columns are resident in memory, and they have a temperature. And if I rerun the DMV, that temperature number will go down to it. So that's all nice and quick because it's over a couple of 100,000 rows. Now let's try us out, and I'm even going to start the server timings while we do this.
And one curious question as you're going through this as well is and this was something that I learned through co-presenting with Kurt, because he talked about a lot of the considerations with direct link, which once it's been paged in, gives you near import performance, but that initial page can sometimes take a bit of time. And I think at the moment, I know quite a few people who, what they do is they have a notebook with a script that yeah, exactly. It auto it pre-warms it on a timed interval just to make sure it always stays in memory and it never gets ejected. But is there anything in the future that's coming related to that will just like there'll be a toggle in a menu that will just let you do that for like for models that you really want to like enforce that never exits?
Yeah, so it's interesting. If you're following best practice, it should page in very quickly. So for example, I'm now about to run a sum over the billion row column that's across the shortcut, and I will come back to you there. So
sure.
What's going to run? When I highlight this text, it'll do the same exercise as before. The piece of text will go to the engine, it'll convert it to a query plan. The query plan will say, I need data for this column. It's not there. It'll reach out to the lakehouse, say, give me everything you've got on this column. The lakehouse will say, I don't have it. I got a shortcut. It's over there in that other lakehouse. That's going to go and get a billion rows for that column. Even if I had filters, it would still get all billion rows, and send it to the first lakehouse, send it up to the analysis services engine. It'll lay it out in memory. And then finally, when that dust is settled, it'll run the query, which sounds tiring. It sounds slow. But if I run this and I've got server timings enabled, boom, that's how quick it can be, over a billion rows of data. The server timings here is it took 234 milliseconds. And if we look at the DMV now, in the results, we'll see that that column, I've got a spelling mistake in here, is now resident. We can see how much memory it's taking up, the temperature, etc. If I run it again, but I'm going to do an average this time, well, a max. This time round, the column's already in memory, so it doesn't have to do all that extra work to go out to page the data in. It's there, and it'll stay in memory for potentially a long time if the temperature stays high. And if we do need to evict it, well, we can page it in relatively quickly. To show you I wasn't cheating, I'm going to do another column, quantity this here, and we'll do an average of it. I mean, we're only touching one column here, but server timings is on. I've hit the run button, boom. Maybe if I get rid of this extra bracket I don't need and run it, there's the result. The server timings is telling me it took, again, 1/4 of a second to page in another billion rows of data. Now, you mentioned that paging might take some time. The thing about best practice with Direct Lake is cardinality is something you really want to focus on. This particular data set is quite clean. The cardinality is not terrible. I worked recently with a customer, internal customer actually. They had a 3.2 billion row table, and they had a column where they had cardinality was like 70 million unique values. That's actually quite high cardinality, because in Direct Lake, every single unique value has its own dictionary ID. And inside the Parquet Delta tables, inside each row group, they have their own local dictionaries. So in one sub area of the Parquet file, apple will be 1, banana will be 2, cherry will be 3. In the next one, apple will be 3, banana will be 17, cherry will whatever. But we only have one global dictionary in analysis services. So pretty much most of the time spent doing the paging in work is not lifting and shifting the data, it's aligning that dictionary. So the more you can get the cardinality down, the better. So in that case, in that situation, I'm going to show you the Vertipack analyzer. So this table, I've done a 1.5 million row cut of it. Focus on a column called metric, and they wanted to do a sum over this column over and over and over again. Now, when they were paging it in, when it was cold, it was taking anywhere from 60 to 90 seconds to page in because of all that dictionary alignment work. What I suggested was, why don't we split the column up? Take the, because the number had 13 digits, up to 13 digits, 2 decimal places. But if you sort of ignore that, said, why don't we do the traditional, just draw a line down it and take the values and split them across columns. So metric A, so the column called metric in model 2 looked like this. So I had an underscore A, underscore B, underscore C, but you would then create a measure in the model.
I was going to say, so you take the first thing, you multiply it to add the zeros, and then you just plus it by the...
Exactly, and they had 2 decimal places. So I'm going to switch back to the Model 1. Model 1, the column was using 7.3 gig of data and dictionary size to store this column. Model 2, column A, B, and C were using 180 megs, 130 megs, less than 100. And the cardinality was 10,000, 10,000, and 3,500. That's sort of the bit off to the right. So the model size shrunk. So model A, this actually includes this table here, went from 15 gig down to 1.3 gig in terms of how much size. The time it took to page the data in went from anywhere from 60 to 90 seconds to less than a second. And that's paging in all 3 columns because of the cardinality. But the real kicker, the query speed, if we were to run this was a query that I was running that did a grouped by date, filtered by a given day, summing a metric, count rows. This was the query plan that it generated. Still pretty fast, once the data had got paged in after it had taken 60 to 90 seconds to page in. But it took 700 milliseconds or 2 seconds of CPU time. The equivalent, the exact same query that gave exactly the same answer in the split column was here, 125 milliseconds of actual total runtime, but the compute was a third. And it's still provided exactly the same answer. It works more nicely for some. You might need to do some average, pretty cool. Count rows, cool. Max, probably not so much of a win on the query speed time, but you get the model size and you get the time it takes to page data in. So cardinality is going to be something you really look at. That's where Delta Analyzer that we mentioned earlier. Delta Analyzer, you can download it to Fabric, run it on your Lakehouse tables, and it'll tell you things like cardinality and page, your Parquet files, etc. I'm conscious that we're getting near time. So if you've got any questions about that, or you want to go in
we do
any
have
other
another
direction.
question, and we also don't have any hard stops. So if you have another 10 or 15 minutes just to go through some stuff, we can always have a nice organic wrap up with this, because I like this stuff is great. I honestly, it that scenario, I would have never have thought to split a
Numeric
an
columns.
actual like sales amount column, but like it goes on the same type of practices on, like, sometimes is with currency. If
Date
you
and
have
time.
15 decibels, you might set it to you round to the nearest cent or something like that, which also does help. But the
Precisely. If you're
near
using float
zero,
data
yeah,
types, yeah, your
yeah,
cardinality is going to be automatically potentially a lot higher than if you're limiting it to 4 or 2 decimal places.
yeah,
And that cardinality is going to impact direct lake on the time
yep,
it takes to page data in, but also the model size, and then probably also on your query speed. So that's why if you are using direct lake, you choose to use that, then a good thing to just think about and monitor is high cardinality columns. And there are tricks like
that's clever.
date and time. We've been doing this for years and years and years. We split them usually into 2 columns. Often we even completely throw away the time column, and we can still do our reporting and analytics, meet requirements, etc. This particular technique doesn't work so well on a high cardinality dimension table that you want to filter or group by, but you probably don't have as many of those as
Well,
potentially
yeah,
this bumping into this kind of thing, especially
because
at larger
yep.
orgs.
You can't do that with a key, because you like because the relationship requires the data to be pre-assembled
Yeah.
for that. But if it's something that gets summed, then that makes a lot of sense. Like I will add that into my repository of the practices of splitting up a long string when possible. But you had the example that I was just about to give, which is the date time. Like the amount of cardinality in a date time table is you're gonna add gigabytes of data to your file for a single dimensional table. So best practice splitting it up. I have a great question from Greg. So the demo shown didn't have a relationship, and he's heard that Direct Lake does not cache or optimize the generation of related indices. So should we expect queries across large relationships to be slow when cold?
No. What do you mean by slow? Yeah, slow as in the time it takes to page the data in. Well, again, if you've got low cardinality columns, they'll get paged into memory very quick. But then
Hmm.
from that point, once the data is in memory, then you can expect very similar query speed performance to what you would get from an import model. So I don't see why relationships over, in this demo example, I imported a table where I didn't have a natural dimension table. I could add it. I could
Mm.
go and do that
Yeah,
now,
yeah,
like a
okay.
date table, and we could run it, but it wouldn't make much difference here once the data is paged in. And if I add a date, what's the cardinality of a date table? 700 values over
True.
2
Okay.
years. So now it is an interesting question about, once you do have the data paged in, how does it compare with import? So there are a couple of things that are
Mm.
different about import and direct lake. They're minor, trivial, and they are things that we're working on. So you can expect generally to get direct lake queries on par within
Mhm.
5% of import. Um, in fact, actually, there are some tricks that you can do on in your Delta Lake with column partitioning that sacrifice a little bit of transcoding speed or paging speed that mean you can have direct lake queries significantly faster than their import equivalent. But you could
Oh,
also
okay.
apply the same tricks to import as well. In fact, if I'm going to jump to that, because I did do this exercise on a very large data set, I've got a
And as you're
here.
showing this, I'll just read out Greg's follow up on when for clarification on your question back to him on slow. So he's referring to like the slow, where a first query time to result would be significantly different than a warm model time to result with the follow up. If it has to do significant work to build the relationship index, e.g., like a large relationship of 10 million row dimension table on the one side. So, a bit like a massive
Mm,
model or something.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, uh, direct lake, sure enough, there's potentially some things that'll mean the paging in exercise on the initial hit, the cold cache, will be slower.
Yep.
But you can create cache warming. You can run. There's a bunch of different ways that you can probably do this in a Fabric notebook. Either query
Yep.
individual columns. You can write some smart code to go. Let's do a DMV. Let's look at the hot temperature columns. Figure out the top 20, 40%.
Mm.
Perform a reframe, and then reissue a series of or a block of DAX queries that just do a count rows of
Mm.
values of that column, etc. So there's things that you can do that are cache warm. But don't forget, if you were to import the same data, it's probably going to take significantly longer, including the work to get these
True.
join indexes populated. But of course, in import, you've got a wide variety of data sources. Import, there's more than 200 data sources that you can connect to. With Direct Lake, you really only have a single source. That has to be these Parquet files and Delta tables somewhere in Fabric, where a lot of that work's being done for you upstream and getting it pretty much into the right shape, albeit for those dictionaries. How do I jump forward to this guy here? Some numbers. Here's here's an example with a really high cardinality. I had 4 models, one with V-order, one without V-order, which you haven't touched on yet, partitioned with V-order, Z-order and V-order. Now this one here, very high cardinality, like 200 million user IDs in a massive table. It would page in 2.5 minutes on the fast versions of the model, and the slower ones, we were taking the time and effort to partition the data, was taking 3 times as long to do that slow page in. But the sacrifice or the benefit you get on the query speed, think about this column here, the I don't know if my laser pointer is working. On query speed, come on, next. Here, I had 3 queries, query 1, query 2, query 3. Query 1 on the partition was taking 47 seconds of actual elapsed time, only half a second of compute CPU time across all the cores, for example, running exactly the same query on a Delta table that doesn't include V-order without column partitioning. It was using, nearly a second of elapsed time, but significantly more compute time that's going to show up in your capacity metrics app. It's going to mean other people get held up behind you potentially when you've got high concurrency. Query 2, and the queries that I were doing was difference. Yeah, I don't have them listed here. Whoops, I've jumped back here. The second query, equally, we saw some benefit. But you can with this technique end up overfitting to a certain query. So you do have to be careful about what you column partition on. The results I'm seeing the best, the approach that I'm seeing the best results for across the board is generally just column partition on date key, because the vast majority of BI queries, visuals, involve some sort of filter or group on a date key. So if you're partitioned by that, you get what is almost effectively segment elimination, because the amount of data inside a segment is generally one value, and it can open the segment and can eliminate it without having to scan it. We're sort of probably diving down too deep to go into it. But there are some tips and tricks that you can do with Direct Lake to make it even smoke import models, because import I would expect to be more like these type numbers compared to Direct Lake if I was to build it here. But you could actually achieve this in import as well with being creative and clever with partitions to control what goes into each segment. So sorry,
Two
I'm
questions. No,
starting
no,
to go
no,
off
no.
on a
And some of this will be good,
tangent
I think,
here.
also to follow up. One from Fernando, but one from me is um for devil's advocate. Is there any reason, or what scenarios might you would you ever not want to apply V order? Like, is there any reason to ever put stuff into a lake house and like not actually apply the V ordering and optimization?
Well, we've survived this long without these, and there are plenty of reasons why. Well, they haven't gone away. So
Any
you
common
talk
one,
about
like yeah.
not using a lake house as your source.
Which is like in a lake house, when you bring the tables in there, there's the option to like, in the GUI to do the view ordering and optimization against the data to apply it. So like,
Mhm.
considering that no view ordering here and everything else is being slower, is there for anybody who's tuning in, is there any common or typical scenario where it actually would make things worse to apply the view ordering and optimization?
No, probably the
Keep it
only
off.
downside of vOrder is the extra compute to do the initial compression. And if
Okay.
you're using a source upstream of Fabric, which is changing regularly, maybe daily, then you have to
Hmm.
reapply the vOrder compute. But once that's done, the benefits are pretty good. And I've got a slide here, just one last slide on vOrder
Sure.
that is a pretty good one to hear. So we had nearly a terabyte of actual real life Microsoft sales data in CSV format. It was nearly a terabyte. And CSV, it's not designed to compress data. It's human readable.
No.
It's not a format that you would use. What we did was we then used a non-Microsoft BI tool to convert that CSV into Parquet Delta tables. And it came down significantly. This is not unexpected. Parquet is significantly better than CSV at compressing data, a third the size. We then applied vOrder to this, and the size came down to 84 gig, a tenth the original size. And normally this sets off a little bit of a red flag. Maybe you're going to add extra compression. If you're really going to aggressively compress something, you have to actually burn the same compute to decompress it to use it. But not only could analysis services, Power BI, read this data, it prefers it. It's going to run. The other red flag is, hey, does this now mean Parquet with vOrder, I'm locked into Microsoft, I'm locked into Fabric? No, you can take this Parquet vOrder, it conforms to the standards of Delta. You could open it and run queries over it in a non-Microsoft BI tool. And not only will it work, it'll actually run faster than if it was to run the same query over the same data in Parquet files that it probably had generated. So the only downside with vOrder is you have to use compute to take maybe
Yeah.
standard Parquet and then apply it to this. And that's going to depend on factors like what's your skew, what's the data look like. But once it's in this state here, then your model size will be smaller. The time to page the data in will be faster, and your queries will run faster. So if you balance that, you've got a very, very high volume of people reading lots and you
Yeah.
write once, then it's going to be your return on investment of actually applying the vOrder. However, if you don't, it'll still work. If you just want to grab Parquet files from a different source or generate them without vOrder, they'll still behave, but for direct lake, it'll take longer to page in, the
Yeah.
model size will be larger, and queries won't be as quick. So
Well, it's essentially the for I think the layman's terms for people who are vaguely familiar with parquets and votors, like the open source format Parquet Delta, like that just exists in the industry. That it's the extra thing that gets it
yes,
down to that 84 is basically the Vertipack engine magic sauce of compression
exactly.
algorithm that goes through like 15 different scenarios. It looks at the column and determines the best way to compress it through a bunch of black magic sauce stuff that's that's proprietary to Microsoft, but still, as you said, is fits the open source standardization of Parquet, which means any platform can read
Yeah.
it. It's just the compression algorithm itself that's like the Microsoft thing.
Yeah, you're not stuck with something proprietary to Fabric.
Yep.
However, you can only apply vOrder using Fabric Compute. We don't actually have a standalone
Yeah.
tool. And we've been working on this for 15 years, which might sound weird because we only
Yeah.
announced Fabric last year, but the algorithms of vOrder are what we've been using in import models for a long time to be able
Yep.
to apply that compression and get the data into
Exactly.
a really optimal space for running queries over, storing it, all those good things that we've been doing for a long, long time. And so this is not something we've just created from scratch in the last few months.
Evolution, not revolution.
Yeah.
The Fernando has a really good question, I think, which goes to also the all this talk of direct lake. So the essentially, is direct lake something that should be used by default, like all the time? What's your stand on Marco's opinion? If your model works well in import, there's no reason to use direct lake. As a quote from Marco.
No, direct lake is not a silver bullet. If you have reports that run slowly today in import, will direct lake fix that? No, they'll still run slow. You've probably got a bad optimized data model. And
Agreed.
the way I like to think of it is it's another tool. So direct query, like if you talk to Marco about direct query, he probably is will tell you why he prefers import to direct query, for example. Whereas I actually think direct query has been it can be the perfect solution to choose for many years in some scenarios, and equally can be the best solution to choose going forward. So for me, Direct Lake is a great new tool in the shed. The other ones are
Yep.
equally important. And then what I'm going to do when I have to craft something now is where I previously could only use two tools, I've now got the option to use three, and it's going to get better. It's not finished by any stretch. So today you can't do hybrid or composite models with Direct Lake. Perhaps in a year or two, you might be able to do these sorts of things and get even more interesting. But absolutely, import is still a fantastic solution. I love it. I would use it for certain scenarios. Equally, there'll be others where the simplicity of not having to worry about paging data in Direct Lake might appeal to me. It probably is more the domain for larger models and larger BI teams.
I would agree.
But so
Because
if you're
it's
doing
good.
no, I was going to say if you're working on small quick fire projects, then it probably doesn't matter, and any of the three solutions can help you there. But it's certainly not designed to replace or remove the existing storage modes.
Yeah.
That
I just like to describe it as the like if you want import performance but further upstream in your tenant for certain core tables or models, like that's kind of to me where the direct link scenario steps in. If you have really big large data
yeah
sets that need to be parked for semantic models, they need to be parked further up, or you have one more location to move something upstream to reduce data movement. Like
yeah
everything
and
really centers around data movement reduction.
And that's the beauty of Fabric, because in the past, you might have some data and you're working with import, and you
Yep.
want to add a column to it that has some sentiment analysis. You might go across the office to the person who's really a bit of a whiz with data science, and they'll say, "Yeah, give me a cut of your data," and you'll save it to disk. You'll make a copy of it. You'll give that to them, and they'll do their magic, and they'll score it, and they'll give it back to you. And
Yep.
you got to figure out how to automate that and process it. Where these days, you can just give them access to your lakehouse, and they can see your delta table and add the column, and it's available in your model, and you don't have to refigure out managing your import process.
Exactly.
It does make certain scenarios a little easier to do, which is nice, but it doesn't mean what we have been doing for years and years and years needs to stop or needs to change. But I certainly would new projects have a good look. I'd probably actually experiment. I'd say let's build an import POC and a direct lake POC and
Mm,
see
okay.
what we like and what we don't like about either, and
Mm,
see which ones wins. In fact, I've come up with a new presentation where I'm going to do it almost Olympic style. I'm going to set direct query and import a series of Olympic tasks and run them off against each other to see who's will win the day, which is topical with the Olympics happening this year. So
nice. The actually, if you have time, I have two other good follow-ups as well of
yeah,
some remaining questions about some Parquet and direct lake scenarios. So first
sure.
one up was from Greg again. Will Power BI Desktop ever learn how to read Parquet instead of ABF and save to it with viewer?
I don't know. I don't work with the Power BI desktop teams. In fact, what I find is I tend to use Power BI desktop less and less. And as I sort of probably mentioned earlier, Direct Lake is probably more suited to the larger data sets where you don't want to
Yeah.
suck it down to your local laptop, maybe. But in terms of the answer to that one, I don't know. It probably has all the bits and pieces there. It's just a case of whether it bubbles up ideas.powerbi.com as a feature that a lot of people would love to be able to do. That might help the people who own the Power BI desktop product figure out. But I think it's not a technical impossibility. It is probably a community ideas.powerbi.com thing that might decide and determine if and when that happens, would be my guess. So the challenge with vOrder is maybe making it. We do want to keep that secret source as a feature of Fabric as well. So
And something like Tabular Editor, I think, is like for especially with enterprise models, it's just a better tool anyway to be able to do changes directly in the service.
yeah,
So That's already compatible with lake houses in a lot of degrees, and I'm sure like the tight knit integration will continue to grow
Yeah, but
with that.
I am using Power BI Desktop less and less these days and doing
Mhm.
more in the web-based model authoring experience, which is great. It every time I look at it, every month there's another feature, another capability in
Yep.
the web model authoring, which appeals to people that use large data exfiltration, Mac users. There's
I
lots
was
of
gonna say Mac users. Yeah.
yeah,
People who are on Linux.
exactly. And you had
What was
another
the other?
question?
Yes, it did. Donald Parrish, and I'll actually pair this with a two-parter because somebody else had a follow-up on his. So he wanted to know, will user-defined aggregations work with Direct Lake? And Guillermo just tag onto this one. Also in the same vein, what about field parameters? So will user-defined aggregations and/or field parameters work with Direct Lake?
So the first one, user-defined aggregations as a feature do not yet work with Direct Lake. So that
Mhm.
is coming. But
Okay.
you can do manual aggregation. So this is writing
Mm.
ugly if statements in your DAX measure, which
Yeah.
will work, like old school aggregations. But as of today, no, there's the built-in user-defined aggs to auto switch your code between columns. Not yet, but
Okay.
is on the um, roadmap. And the field parameters, I'm pretty sure they work today. Field parameters is more a, I could be wrong because I don't use them necessarily heavily, but I thought that was a Power BI thing that it throws into the
Eh,
query that it gets generated. I'd have to check. I've got a
yeah,
funny feeling that they do, but
I
I'm
would
not
say yeah.
100% sure.
I think yes, because I mean, you need to do a composite model because it generates a local table.
Hmm.
But if you connected to the source, via direct link, turn composite modeling on, then you should just be able to add the field parameter because then it's a DAX generated table sitting locally in the PBX file. So I haven't done it myself, but I would think that should as long as direct lake connections to the
Yeah.
lakehouse supports composite modeling, then it should be just yes.
Yeah, so the challenge is field parameters are much easier to set up in Power BI Desktop, and Zoe, I think, has demonstrated connecting to and editing um, a Power BI model with Power BI Desktop, but I'm not sure if that
Mm,
functionality is out yet. So you probably need to configure it, set it up somehow in Tabular Editor or in the Tinsel script, and then apply it. So if you're comfortable and confident enough to do that, it probably will work. I know calculation groups do. We've got the buttons on the ribbon in
yeah.
the UX. They're there for calculation groups, but field parameters might be one of those things that works at the engine level, but we haven't quite caught up the user UX. So if you are expert and
Yeah.
proficient to know how to go and configure your model, probably a fairly easy test. But I have to say, honestly, I can't remember. I'm not sure off the top of my head if they go. But user-defined aggregation is definitely not yet,
But
and that
it is
pains
in the
me because I'm a
pipeline.
big fan of
Yeah.
aggregation. So
Yeah, well, it's iterative, as you said. This is evolving. Like calculation groups, when this first came out, weren't supported. They eventually got supported on lake houses and direct lakes. So they're slowly adding, the modeling features. So I would
yeah,
assume
but
that a lot of these limitations will go away in the next couple of years, if
yeah,
not
and
sooner.
under the covers, calculation groups kind of spin up a calculator table for you. So the fact that they can work probably is a good sign for the field parameter question. It might do
Yeah,
something similar. So
exactly. Excellent. And I think with that, that's pretty much all the questions. So we can use that probably as a nice segue to then wrap up. But
yeah,
I very happy with the active chat. Looks like we had about a peak of 27, 28 people tuning in.
nice.
Some from the US and even over from Europe during their late night. So I want to thank you for coming on, walking through all this stuff. It was also some fun conversations as well to be able to dig in and get a bit nerdy, both at the high level, but also in the detail of how the engines work and everything. So a lot of appreciation from people across the globe as well. So thank you
No,
so much
thank
for coming on and taking time out of your Saturday.
No worries. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Thanks for everyone who got on the call. Those questions were great, and there's a lot more to the space, and it's not finished
Mhm.
by any stretch. It's only going to get better, and we want your help to shape that as well. So, getting your feedback, getting on
Yeah,
ideas.powerbi.com also helps us make sure that we're building the right things the right way in the right order. We don't get it right all the
absolutely. And
time, but
yeah.
we try. It's
Well, it's things evolve and grow and learn, right?
mm.
Everything's iterative. But looking forward to getting you back on at some point as well into the future. And thank you so much again for taking your time out of the weekend.
Yeah, I'll look out for that session you're doing with Kerry because it is kind of she did design a pretty good game. I just help with the DAX.
I'm
Don't
excited
look
for
at the
that one.
DAX.
Yeah.
The DAX is big. It's,
Well,
mm.
and then
All right.
she's one of my favorite people when it comes to design, so I think that'll be a great session.
Mm.
Cool.
Nice.
Enjoy the rest of
Okay.
your Saturday.
Thank you. Cheers.
All right. Cheers. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you want to help support this channel, take a look at our channel memberships or our merchandise store for cool swag. And last but not least, please consider sharing this video on your social media platform of choice to help our channel grow. So, until next time.